Hello, everyone. My name is Randi Evans, and I'm the Manager of Public Practice and Community Partnerships here at the Jule On-Demand Museum of Fine Art at Auburn University. Welcome to those online and those of us here in the galleries to our series, Common Grounds. Common Grounds is a recurring series that happens every week at the Jule, where we invite scholars, artists, community members, students to share their expertise or practice in relationship to our exhibitions. Tonight, we're excited to present a hybrid gallery lecture and conversation with Dr. Deirdre Madeleine Smith, lecturer of Museum Studies at University of Pittsburgh and Assistant Curator at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. So Dr. Smith will be sharing her research on the origins of animal art in relationship to our current exhibition, Radical Naturalism, Daniel Newman. For this exhibition, Newman produced a series of paintings in collaboration with a variety of non-human animal artists, which is exhibited alongside pieces from the Jule's John James Audubon collection. So we're in those galleries right now, and we'll be looking at this work together after the talk. Although Newman's work may be seen as a novelty, there is a long history of artists and anthropologists who have used non-human animal art to provoke questions about authorship, agency, and anthropocentric creativity. I will turn it over to Dr. Smith now, but we will have time after her lecture to look at some of the pieces more closely and have a little bit of a conversation. We're really excited. We know that there are some of the animal artists joining us as well, so we look forward to the conversation with Dr. Smith, and I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Randi. Good evening to the audiences online and in person in the museum. I would like to thank Randi again just for the invitation to participate in this event and for getting me oriented to this wonderful exhibit all remotely through photographs and FaceTime. I was really delighted to hear about both the Radical Naturalism series as an approach to bringing fresh interpretation to the work of John James Audubon, as well as this iteration with Daniel Newman and 14 non-human animal painters that, as Randi was kind of already getting into, raises really interesting questions about art making and collaboration and non-human agency. And so it's a treat for me to be able to beam into the exhibit and hopefully offer some framing context and questions to think about while visiting the show, as well as for those who are unable to see it, who are online. So I'll talk for about 30-ish minutes, and then we can move into discussion and maybe move around the show a little bit, and hopefully hear from some of the animal painters or their caretakers who are in the audience. So if we could open the slideshow and go to the first slide. So the title for this evening's program, The Origins of Animal Art, comes from an article that I wrote, which was a kind of meta-analysis of attempts by scholars in the life sciences and humanities to answer the questions, do animals other than humans make what some humans call art? And also, what might the behaviors of other animals teach humans about art's origins? Meaning, where and when and why art making appears in evolutionary time. So how I became interested in the subject of non-human animal creativity and art making was by way of my broader interest in the intersection of art history and animal studies. Animal studies is an interdisciplinary field that draws on philosophy, science, history, literature, and art to understand non-human animals themselves, as well as human ideas about and relationships with non-human animals over time. And visual art making is great fodder for animal studies because humans have been making images of other animals more or less as long as we've been making images, that is for tens of thousands of years, as the example on screen demonstrates. And the images that humans make of other animals and also with other animals, as we'll be getting into this evening, always reflect something about human beliefs and ideas about those animals. And that's kind of where it becomes interesting. If we go to the next slide. When it comes to the history of art, I am a scholar of contemporary art, and so I'm often thinking and writing about works of art that in some way challenge but also clarify concepts of what can constitute a work of art, which I think is something that Daniel Newman and his collaborators are doing in this show. At the intersection of animal studies, that might also look like the work that I'm showing on screen here, which I've written about in the context of the idea of the multi-species family. And this is documentation of Jonas Gilman and Sarena Dor's project that began in 2019 and involved their cohabiting with a flock of pigeons as an experiment in art and life and theater, and in creating an environment of care and collaboration with a species that is sometimes treated as a pest by humans. Now I'll get into some of those passages in the history of art and science where the idea of a non-human animal artist is referenced or produced or debated. And my aim here is to place the paintings that you see in this exhibition in a longer trajectory. Because while they are very much of our contemporary moment in this multi-species culture and history, they also have revealing resonances across much longer spans of time. And I'll be calling out to some of those connections as I go. And it's important to say from the start that non-human animal creativity is something that humans have had ideas about for a very long time. I'm highlighting on this slide that the cosmologies of several indigenous cultures of present-day North America include a figure known as Spider Woman in Navajo culture, or Spider Grandmother, who figures into stories of the origins of the planet and also the human ability to weave. And this is a divine figure, but also one who can take an animal or spider form. This kind of cosmology and origin story for human weaving and human activity, which is just one example I could point to, already tells us that often non-human animal creativity is something that humans think about when considering their relationship to the universe, the divine, and to nature. And that will continue as a thread, so to speak, as we go. So while the idea of a painting dog or a painting parrot is totally playful and can be humorous, and often has been played for humor in the history of art, it also can connect us to really profound questions and ideas as well. So if we go to the next slide. Getting into that history of art, I'll describe 3 moments of interest that involve collaborative image making between human and non-human animals, or the suggestion of a non-human artist. The themes here will definitely be humor and pranks, but also reflections of human values about what art is and should be and shouldn't be, being volleyed back and forth between humans through and with non-human animal interlocutors and collaborators. So first, I'm pointing to an anecdote about the Japanese artist Hokusai, which recounts that in a competition with a more traditional painter, Hokusai had the novel idea to collaborate with another animal. So he made an image by painting a sheet of paper blue, then dipping a chicken's feet in red paint and urging it to run across that sheet of paper. Hokusai explained that this blue field with red chicken feet tracks was meant to depict a river with maple leaves floating in it. And thus he won the competition. I suspect that that story is not true, but it's still revealing, right, of ideas about artists and about artworks made with other animals. Insofar as it is something of an allegory, it's meant to demonstrate Hokusai's cleverness and innovation and his connection to nature, or his skill in working with nature, which in a representational paradigm of art making is the artist's ultimate task. And as the moral of the story suggests, it contributed to his being considered a superior artist. So next slide. Here I'm sharing some examples of a genre of painting called singerie, which comes from the French word for monkey, singe, and consists of images of monkeys engaging in human behaviors, including painting and evaluating paintings in fine clothing. This is a genre that was popularized in Europe, especially in France, in the 17th and 18th centuries. So we're moving back in time here from the anecdote about Hokusai, but also into a different kind of image of the non-human animal artist, even if it is a kind of fantasy in this case. But as with the Hokusai, we once again have a reflection of human ideas about art making and about human relationships to nature. So one interpretation of Saint-Jury is that it is in part a joke, kind of at the expense of both humans and non-human ends, about how humans can only hope to imitate or ape the world around them when they make images of it. Next slide. Saint-Jury provides a good opportunity to start pointing to some of the images in the Radical Naturalism exhibition, several of which, for those of you who are in the galleries, you should see before you, that were made collaboratively with a monkey named Pockets Warhol, who makes his images by deliberatively spreading prepared paint with his fingers. Pockets lived his early life as a pet, but now resides at the Storybrooke Farm Primate Sanctuary in Sunderland, Ontario, where painting is something that Pockets does as a form of enrichment, meaning physical and mental exercise and entertainment for animals living in different forms of captivity. So Pockets both participates in an idea of the monkey painter that humans have actually been playing with imaginatively for centuries. But more significantly than in the images of monkey painters that humans used to make as Saint-Jury, Pockets is an actual being living an experience of life that has been fundamentally shaped by human intervention, and who paints as a way of existing in and coping with that life. So if we go to the next slide. I'll be getting more into the history of other non-human primates who, like Pockets, paint shortly, but I wanted to first share one more moment in the history of art that involves a human and a non-human making a painting together. We are now in 1910 Paris, where this painting was displayed at the Salon des Indépendants, and which in that moment might have passed for a work of Fauvism, a human painting movement associated with artists like Henri Matisse and Maurice de Vlaminck that involved using bold, non-representational colors and visible gestural brushstrokes to create scenes. And that name, Fauvism, famously came from the suggestion that these artists painted like wild beasts, or in French, fauves. If we go to the next slide, we can see how this painting was actually made and how it both comments on and literalizes the suggestion that modernist painters are somehow animalistic. Because while this painting was submitted to the exhibit as having been produced by an artist named Joachim Raphael Boronali, it was actually an image made as a kind of prank initiated by a French author named Roland Dorgelet, that involved affixing a paintbrush to the tail of a donkey named Lolo, who lived in the Parisian neighborhood of Montmartre and was the companion animal of the proprietor of a bar called the Agile Rabbit, where a lot of artists hung out and where this infamous hoax was born. With the intention of mocking the Fauvists by proving that a painting made in part by a donkey's tail could fit in with modern art and be accepted into one of the most prominent exhibitions of modern painting at that time. Next slide, have another call out here to the work of Daniel Newman and his collaborators. So Newman did not work with any donkey painters, but there are several paintings in the exhibit that Newman made with a miniature horse named Mickey. For those of you in the gallery, those paintings should be behind you on the other side of the gallery to your right, if I'm understanding the photographs I've seen correctly. So Mickey paints with a brush in his mouth, not his tail. And once again, I'm pausing here to underscore both the continuities and the breaks that our moment in non-human animal art making and this particular exhibition represent within this broader history that I'm sharing. So Lolo the donkey and Mickey the horse are both species and individual animals that live with and are bred by humans and that have evolved alongside humans, often in a complicated history of positions of service to humans, speaking broadly just of the donkey and the horse as species. But in the cases of these two individual animals, they have been brought into this more unusual activity of making marks on a canvas. So for Lolo, this was just one moment in her life among artists and eccentrics in Paris in the service of a human prank. And for McKee, this is again part of his enrichment and activities in which he's been trained through positive reinforcement by his human caretakers. In the context of this exhibition, these paintings that result from that activity stand as both a sincere invitation by the human artist Daniel Newman to look at the activities of this really wide variety of non-human animals that paint today. That is in contrast to Lolo and Dorgelès. But I suspect that there is also a commonality or kind of continuity of intentional provocation and intervention into the history of art that Newman is also making in terms of how these paintings are meant to speak back to the work of John James Audubon in the show in particular. So if we go to the next slide, I'm now going to spend some time on the history of science as it intersects with the history of non-human animal image making. Coincidentally, this really picks up in the 1910s at the same time that the Lolo prank was orchestrated, and as an outgrowth of the development of animal behavior science and primatology, which involved both trying to understand non-human animal behaviors and capacities, but also in the case of primates and often chimpanzees, trying to probe the contrasts and limits between human and chimpanzee behavior, and in so doing to understand the origins or evolutionary development of certain human behaviors. And as an example of, kind of what this looked like in this early moment, there was a Russian researcher named Nadezhda Kots who observed and experimented with a young chimpanzee that she called Yoni, including by giving Yoni pencils to draw with. And then later she compared Yoni's behaviors and drawings to those of her son, Rudy, and published a study about that. So on the next slide, I'm showing some of the results of the more systematic attempts to study non-human primate mark making or drawing that followed after those kind of initial forays of someone like Coates in the 1910s. And these kinds of studies actually continue into the present moment. Some of the conclusions of this body of research are that some, not all, chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans can develop an interest in and practice of drawing and mark making that is engaging to them, that will evolve over time, that is not random, that can be trained to an extent, and that will display both individual variation as well as variation by species. And these studies have continued to find uniformly that non-human species never make representational images. They're always abstract or gestural, like the ones that you see here and that you see all around you in the exhibit. So next slide. I'm going to pause here on the question of how is art being implicitly defined here? We've seen so far, right, that in their experiments with and imaginings of non-human artists or creators or collaborators, humans are typically projecting, intentionally or not, their own biases and values about humans, animals, and art. And in my working through this history, kind of parsing those implicit definitions became really central to my attempt to interpret it. In this case, the images made in these studies are not art per se, but the studies are partly motivated by ideas about the evolutionary origins of art making and specifically of drawing. And here I would say that art making is being defined in a fundamental way as a kind of motor behavior or process, connected to play, connected to cognitive development, that non-human primates share a capacity for with humans, even if that capacity manifests differently. And while this definition of art making as a kind of motor skill is fairly humble, I think that in a way it can also be quite liberating also to humans. So if we go to the next slide, I have a quotation from one of the scientists who's working in this field today, who writes in 2021 that within this field of non-human primate drawing and painting studies, And in the future of the field, it is necessary to go beyond a simple interest in the finished product and explore the very dynamic of the mark-making process. And this is a compelling point, I think. Is something about art making ultimately more about the process of making marks than the final product? And is that a kind of lesson that humans can learn by looking at what non-human animals do when they paint and draw that would actually run counter to some human ideas about art that tend to prize and fetishize that final product? So next slide. I think that all of this is a really interesting point to think about in terms of the context of this exhibit, where there are marks made by so many different kinds of animals. So if you look around just the room where those of you in the gallery are seated, there are marks and images made by a monkey, a rabbit, a parrot, a sloth, a horse. And then in this exhibition, you can look between the images and study the variations in those marks, which are indexes of the different kinds of bodies and brains of those animals, as well as the choices of their caretakers in what kinds of materials they have access to. So for example, I'm inviting you here to think comparatively about the images and marks made by Cody, who is an Australian Shepherd and Border Collie mix, who paints with a brush or a roller in his mouth. And so the marks that you see come from kind of the jerks and swipes of Cody's head. Cody's paintings are in the next room for those of you in the gallery, along with a number of paintings made by other dogs. But on this slide, I'm comparing them to the paintings made by Koa the parrot, which should be next to those of Maki the horse on the far side of the gallery. And you can see that in contrast to those paintings made by Cody and his caretaker, these ones by Koa are very small. They're Koa-sized images. And it's notable that, you know, the marks that Koa makes by holding a brush in his beak and moving his head all tend to kind of congregate at the lower register of the canvas, tend to be quite short and kind of point upward and outward in dashes and curves that kind of track the movements of his head and neck while he paints. Next slide. Moving back into that history of science, the 1950s are where things get really complicated and fascinating, I think, and also more familiar to our moment, perhaps, and to the exhibition at hand. So in the mid-1950s, there is an explosion in painting activity by chimpanzees and other primates around the world, both in scientific and entertainment contexts. So two prominent chimpanzees in this moment were named by their human caretakers, Congo and Baltimore Betsy. Congo and Betsy both lived at zoos, and they both painted as a form of human entertainment on television. So Congo in particular also was a participant in studies that were undertaken with his primary caretaker, Desmond Morris, who you can see in one of these photographs on screen, looking very affectionately at Congo. Morris was a scientist and also an artist based in London, and he had learned about some of the studies that had taken place earlier in the 20th century and was interested in continuing that work, but also in extending that activity into the realm of entertainment and into the art world. So he gave Congo, who was a juvenile at the time, paints and brushes, and Congo and Morris developed a very controlled and highly collaborative process for making images like the one that you see on screen here that resulted in 400 paintings between 1956 and 1959. Baltimore Betsy, who you see at the right, was a resident at the Baltimore Zoo. Unlike Congo, she painted with her fingers, but you can see in this photograph that she was nevertheless also made to conform to certain stereotypical Western ideas about, you know, the appearance of an artist by wearing a beret and a smock in order for her to kind of read as an artist. And as you can see on the bottom right of the slide here, Congo and Betsy's paintings appeared at an exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London in 1957, which garnered the attention of artists and art historians at that time who debated the implications of chimpanzee paintings at that same moment that many human painters were favoring abstract gestural painting as well. Next slide. Kind of pause again to ask and consider that question of how art is being implicitly defined in this kind of zeitgeist around chimpanzee and other primate painting in the 1950s. It's obviously become messier and more polyphonic than what we saw earlier with Nadezhda Kotz's studies, and even more entwined with multiple ideas about what human art is and what humans and non-humans might share when they paint. So if we go to the next slide, we will see a comment from Desmond Morris that he made in the catalog essay for the exhibition. The activity was clearly a reward in itself. Apart from the interest of handling a new set of objects, drawing held a special fascination for Congo, which can only be described, described as the joy of producing something out of nothing, the joy, if you wish, of creation. So here, the possibility of a kind of universal pleasure in the act of creativity is being cast upon Congo's actions. And while it's true that left to his own devices, Congo obviously never would have painted because painting is simply not relevant to the life of most chimpanzees, Morris observed and wants to believe and kind of put forward the idea that this activity has been both positive for Congo and revelatory for humans. Next slide. Another factor at play is the idea that an image or object becomes art when it is accepted by experts and institutions. And that the more kind of instances and contexts of that affirmation, the more credible that claim as art becomes. And so from that starting point in the 1950s, when there was an active debate about the Betsy and Congo paintings, these images have only continued to receive more affirmation and credibility in their status as art. So Congo's work continues to be shown at galleries and in museums. He had a catalogue raisonné produced of his paintings in 2019. Paintings by Congo sold for as much as $17,000 at an auction in 2005. And in the case of Betsy, director John Waters, who grew up watching her on television, purchased her paintings and donated them to the Baltimore Museum of Art. So if we go to the next slide, coming back into this exhibition here, how can we compare these two moments in the history of non-human animal image making that are starting to feel more similar, I think, than what we've looked at before? So I have on this slide an image of Ivy, another Australian shepherd who paints with her caretaker and whose paintings are on view in the next room as well, and Betsy. So on this slide, we have two animals in berets being posed between an easel with paintings that they've produced and a camera and an audience. Ivy's photo is made by her caretaker, her human companion, and circulated on social media. Betsy's is made in the context of a zoo's television program. Ivy lives in a context where I hope she will have a long, healthy, happy life, whether she's painting or not. And unfortunately, Betsy did not have that same opportunity living in an urban zoo in the 1950s. But she does get to have this kind of strange legacy now as an artist. And I'll point out here that something that was really important to Daniel Newman in picking the animals that he worked with was that they had existing painting practices and that they were not living in zoos. And while I certainly don't intend to say that humanity on the whole has a more enlightened approach to how we consider and treat other animals today, it is true that the consideration of agency and the options for living a happy and decent life have at least evolved for many species and individuals. And that image making offers a kind of interesting window into that, right? So Ivy, as an Australian Shepherd, is a kind of dog who has been bred by humans to herd. And so by the nature of that breeding, right, like she's someone who enjoys having a job to do. As a way to relate to those around her and occupy the wiring of her mind. And so that's part of why she probably has taken to the task of painting in the way that she has, and why it's probably beneficial to her. So Ivy and Betsy and the paintings that they make and the exhibitions that they participate in are both part of complicated histories of the entanglement between human and non-human animals, but with important differences in terms of care and the broader context of how they live and why they paint. So next slide. Before we get into the show itself, I wanted to raise kind of one final series of artifacts that pull us in a pretty different direction, but I think are important to share when considering this question of the agency of the non-human animals whose work surrounds you. I've mostly been talking about images that are always fundamentally collaboratively made with humans. So the paintings that Daniel Newman made for this show are collaborative insofar as he also painted on the canvases before sharing them with Ivy and Cody and Koa and Mickey and Pockets and the other animals. But an image that one of those animals makes without Daniel Newman is also a collaboration between these animals and their caretakers who have introduced them to and encouraged them to paint. However, there are a few different examples within animal behavior where animals produce artifacts or constructions that are, in essence, analogous to human art making, and that scholars have made arguments or claims for being a kind of autonomous non-human art tradition. And that can also hone or clarify a fundamental sense of what art is. And so these are the bowers that bowerbirds make and the sand patterns that white-spotted pufferfish make. Bowerbirds are a group of species that live in parts of Australia and New Guinea. And as part of their courtship behaviors, male bowerbirds build these elaborate structures that consist of thousands of sticks made into different designs and that are further decorated by the bowerbird with hundreds of different colored objects that they scavenge. Some are even painted by the birds holding a stick in their mouth with a pigment that they produce by chewing up plants or charcoal. This is a learned behavior. It displays all kinds of variations in design and decoration and region. And females, for their part, evaluate the bowers and select the males that they will breed with based on which bowers they prefer. And so there is a cultural relationship between the selection of bowers and selection of males and genes and preferences that get passed on and that continues to influence this tradition. Beneath the photograph of the bower, I have on screen an image of these beautiful sand designs that the males of a species of pufferfish make by kind of sinking and fluttering their fins into the sand to displace sand in this kind of concentric pattern as part of their courting behavior. And interestingly, in this case, there is a structural and practical purpose to this design, which is to resist currents and therefore protect the eggs that a female will lay kind of right in the center of that design. So next slide. I'm asking kind of for the final time, if we want to apply the label of art here, as some people have, right, what kind of definition of art emerges and what can it offer to us? In the case of the bowerbird and the pufferfish, something arguably very akin to human art making has emerged independently in bird culture and fish culture. And that is, to use the example of the bower, a thing that one has to learn to make, that varies between individuals and groups, that requires particular skills, that is interesting to look at, made to be seen and evaluated, and that facilitates particular kinds of social interactions, in this case, mating. So that's one pretty good definition of art that emerges if we're open to kind of looking at something like a bower as art. So we can cut the slides now. And I'll just say as a kind of summary and kind of conclusion to this portion of the program that this exhibition in sharing images made with and by non-human animals and posing the possibility of a non-human artist, one, participates in a really long and complex history. Two, in that history, we typically see humans existentially negotiating their ideas about their relationships to nature and divinity with art made through non-human creativity and collaboration. And three, that the topic of non-human animal art making can challenge and clarify the meaning and purpose of art in really important ways, because to affirm that non-human animals have the ability to make something that some humans might call art, both collaboratively with humans and for themselves, is to affirm that art is biological, social, collaborative, flexible, funny, practice-oriented. And that on the other hand, to deny that non-humans have these abilities is to say that art making is unique to humans and something that humans kind of seek to hoard for themselves, that would in turn be tied to really false and dangerous ideas about human superiority over other creatures. So I really applaud Daniel Newman and all of his collaborators and their caretakers for providing an occasion to think about all this. And I hope that this exhibit makes you think differently about other animals and about art.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. That was really fascinating. So I know that during your presentation, we were getting comments in on our live stream. So I think those are gonna go up now on the bottom of the screen, but we're also here to take questions from our online audience as well as our in-person audience. So I see a lot of people that are have animals that they paint with or that they own that paint. So that's great.
Yeah, and I think Peggy is the person who trained McKee how to paint and helped make the paintings that we see here. So hi, Peggy.
Thanks for joining us. Are there any questions from the people in the galleries? And I can relay those to Dr. Smith. Yes.
So earlier she discussed that some of the animals they receive positive reinforcement. At what point do you move from positive reinforcement to actually basically directing the animal rather than it being part of their own creative process?
Great. I don't know if you heard that, but I'll kind of summarize what she asked. Dr. Smith mentioned that a lot of the animals receive positive reinforcement while they're painting or working, and she's just wondering about what's the line between positive reinforcement and actually directing the animal what to do, and I mean, I guess questions of agency and what that line is.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I would love to hear one of the facilitators of painting who's in the audience chime in on this as well. But, you know, I think, as I tried to say, all of these images are collaborative, no matter what, right? Like a dog, a horse, a monkey, they're not going to decide to paint on their own. And so they need to be kind of trained to do it to some extent. But that being said, I mean, I think as I understand what I've learned about how this works is that, you know, the animal has to kind of enjoy the action to some extent. And so that kind of enjoyment, and again, just sort of the uniqueness of their body and their mind will have an influence on the way that the image looks. And, you know, this works in different ways. So I know that Cody, for example, who has paintings in the show, picks his own colors. And so, you know, there are different opportunities for the expression of agency, but it is fundamentally a human-directed or human-initiated, let's say, activity that is then consensually and collaboratively participated in by another animal. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if somebody in the audience kind of wants to say a little bit about sort of how they think about kind of the boundary between the agency of the animal, you know, of Cody and their caretaker, for example.
Oh, someone is commenting, once McKee learned the strokes, which is the horse paintings over on the side over here, he would walk over and stand by the canvas and wait there. So there seemed to be some sort of acknowledgement of maybe of what he was doing or that he was done. But again, learning the strokes, you know, implies that there is some sort of teaching involved in that as well. It is interesting, Dr. Smith, when you're mentioning too, that different breeds like the shepherd likes to have a job or is, you know, and so it having a task to do, whether it's herding animals or putting paint on a canvas might be kind of equivalent to it in some ways, potentially.
Yeah, and I think, you know, from what I understand, right, like not all animals who are trained to paint like painting or will kind of develop a practice, but there are some animals, whether that's because of the relationship that they have with their caretaker or their breed, like they enjoy doing it and they have a relationship to mark making that evolves over time, which is what Peggy is describing happened with McKee. Oh, and we have another comment here.
Yes, so this person, I'm the human of Peekaboo, the blind puppy in the gallery. And I'll note for the people in the galleries that all the pieces are attributed to a certain animal and has the animal's name on it. So you can look at these later. This person, Alicia, says the behaviors are shaped in picking up a brush, standing and facing the correct location, but there's nothing exact that can be orchestrated about how the animal actually puts the tip to the surface. It's sort of like telling a child where is okay to draw and what to draw with. So what I'm kind of getting from this is that there's the humans are setting the parameters within which the art can be created, but they're not maybe dictating exactly what they're doing, but they're creating the conditions or the parameters within which the art can happen. Are there other questions in here? There's a question online. First, given that we are learning new things about the sophistication and intelligence of animals every day, do you foresee a future where we objectively accept animal art as, quote, uppercase A art? So again, thinking about how we differentiate fine art or things that we see in the galleries versus to things that maybe we do for pleasure, and there's questions of that earlier, and he says, as a follow-up, what will need to be proven for that to be so?
So interesting question. I mean, as I was saying with regard to this kind of art by institutional acceptance or appropriation, which is, it's not a terribly satisfying definition of art, but it's one that has power, right? I mean, I think like something like the exhibit that's happening today is a sign that this kind of, you know, these kinds of images that are made under the kind of conditions that we've just been talking about are considered to be art. I mean, in this case, right, they kind of needed like the shepherd of Daniel Newman to get them into the show. But just by this exhibit existing and the conversation that we're having, I think it's sort of furthering that possibility. I think that, you know, when it comes to the question of like what is art, not what is accepted as capital A art, that's always kind of up for debate in some way, but there tends to be this kind of snowball effect, right? Like we have that with different kinds of craft traditions that people wouldn't have thought of as art in the past, or different kinds of experimental art that some people questioned. And there might still be some people questioning it, but it's sort of like over time, with more exposure, with more conversation, it comes to be accepted. So I would say that we're sort of already there, even if there are probably some still some naysayers, or we're getting there. So Jess, oh, go ahead. You can read the comment.
Jessie said that she sometimes struggles with letting go of her desire to control the outcome of Cody's paintings, and when I do try to influence or direct him, it often doesn't work. So we can see that in some cases, an animal can refuse or decide not to do something, but there might be sometimes that struggle, as the the first question suggests, about directing, like providing the opportunity, but not over determining what the end result is. Okay, another question.
Yeah, no, just as a follow-up, the reason I was in part asking it, if an animal is producing $17,000 an art piece worth $17,000, the owner very easily could, you know, request that to be mass-produced many times.
Yeah, I think a follow-up comment from the first question, she's saying if, you know, if a trainer or animal owner knows that their animal can produce $17,000 paintings, then they have like a lot of motivation maybe to get that animal to continue to reproduce and make those paintings. And so obviously those are questions that enter about the art market and legitimacy. And again, by having these works in the exhibition, we are now legitimizing them as art, and now they are being seen as having a higher value. But where does that aesthetic value come from, and things like that? It's not really a question, more of a statement, but just kind of speaks to what the motivations of the trainers could be potentially.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of ethical quandaries here. You know, that $17,000 mark is something that happens, right, like on the secondary market where we get into wild speculation territory. I don't think anyone was purchasing a painting by Congo. I don't think anybody is purchasing paintings by the folks in the show for super high prices. They're relatively inexpensive. And I think typically the proceeds, from what I can tell, like looking on people's social media sites, tend to go to charitable organizations or kind of back into the care of the species. And so, you know, fortunately, the people who are kind of facilitating this work today in this context are keeping those ethical quandaries in mind and kind of trying to minimize some of the exploitation or the kind of like wild speculation that is a real risk. Is that any different than people pursuing money for art? I mean that as a sincere question. Absolutely. I mean, this is it's an age-old question. You know, how does the art market influence in negative ways what people produce, and you know, the relationships that people have with each other and to art, and who does it really benefit in the end? I think yeah, the influence of money in art is always kind of an ethical problem, but it's always been a part of art making, right? Art making historically has been really much more of like a profession than a passion as we kind of think about it today. So that conflict actually hasn't even always existed, but is yeah, very much a legitimate concern or something to wrestle with.
I was wondering, we're kind of getting close to the end, but we didn't, oh, there's another, oh, I didn't see behind the screen.
It's okay.
Okay.
I have a question about the tools the animals are given. Are they appropriate to the animal, what they can do? I mean, do they say everybody uses a brush, or I didn't get what the shepherd uses. I mean, I can see them recording their gestures like a parrot, you know, I get that. I don't know if they use a beak or they have a little thing on the beak, but I mean, I guess the human determines what tool the artist will use. I mean, the animal will use, the animal artist will use.
Yes. So the question is about how what tool is chosen for what animal.
Yeah, and the process that's used. Do they have a whole array of paint that they use it, or
in the process that an animal.
With a format already, or do they work on the canvases? That's my question.
Yeah, so lots of questions about how an animal, or what brushes or devices the animal uses to create their artwork, their process in choosing their artwork. And I know a lot of these artists and non-human animal artists have, again, they're working artists, so I think they have, many of them have Instagram accounts that document their process and how they're working. But from what I understand within the show, all of the animals, with the exception of Pockets Warhol, use a brush, whereas Pockets, the monkey, uses his hands. So do you want to comment on if there's any other things that come up in terms of like tools and process?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I definitely encourage people to check out the social media accounts of some of these artists and collaborators if you're curious to kind of watch them at work, which I think is really illuminating. Yeah, for the most part, they use their mouths to hold a brush. And so, like I was saying before, right, like the marks that you see are made by the movements of the head. And if you go into the next room where the dog paintings are, for example, you can really get a sense of like individual variation, which is also variation in terms of like what kind of brush they have. So for the dogs I've seen in many cases, there's kind of like a flat rectangle part that fits into their mouth, and then the brush is in front of that, just to make it easier for them to grip. The paintings by Enzo, the sloth, that we were going to maybe go to for a little bit, but maybe we're running out of time. That's an interesting one where, you know, again, thinking about how like the bodies of all these animals dictates what they do, what will feel good to them. Enzo like is suspended upside down of the painting, holding the brush and kind of like moving like this. And so that produces a really different kind of mark than a dog at an easel with a brush in its mouth, or some of the other processes that you see. And I think, again, this is kind of, those choices are made between the caretaker and the animal, like what works for their body, what feels good to them, what they're capable of doing. Yes, and someone in the comments is saying, well, we use what's most comfortable for the animal.
Great. Any other last questions or comments for Dr. Smith? Okay, have one over here.
I was just curious to know if any of this art on display here was 100% done by the animal artist without any human help.
So the person asked if any of the art in our show of Daniel Newman's was done without any sort of human intervention. And I know for Daniel Newman's work, he is collaborating with the artist, and all the labels say Daniel Newman with Pockets Warhol or with the animals. So no, none of these pieces in this exhibition were done without Daniel first, without Daniel's collaboration. But I think also, Dr. Smith, what you're kind of suggesting is that there is no way that an animal is not, who paints or makes art, is not collaborating with a human in some capacity, right? Besides maybe the last examples you shared with us about the bowerbirds and the fish that are making things that we're seeing as art, but you know, we can't tell as humans, but we can't tell how they're viewing, you know, how they're seeing it. They're serving a function. Yes. So, well, yeah.
Yeah.
Any last comments, or sorry, I kind of summarized maybe what you were.
No, that was great. I think I've appreciated the conversation, especially hearing from some of the caretakers who work with these animals. And yeah, we didn't really get into the portion of the show kind of thinking back and forth with Audubon, but I'll just say that it's really important to think about, right, this contrast between an artist who worked from dead animals, who killed animals for the purposes of his art making. So we have, someone who objectified and killed animals for his collaboratively produced art in the 19th century natural history context. And then we have this really kind of like abundant range of images of animals images made by animals with an artist in this kind of 21st century social media facilitated multi-species image culture that we live in. And so it's really interesting to kind of to think about, to kind of plumb the contrast there. So that's kind of like a last thought that I would leave people with. But yeah, otherwise it's been a pleasure, and thanks so much for your attention and questions, and thanks, Randi, for facilitating.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for our friends watching at home, especially the trainers of the animals whose work is represented in the galleries. Thank you to the people in the galleries who are a part of this experiment with us and trying to do a hybrid virtual gallery talk. And we really appreciate your time, Dr. Smith. And I hope that this might be a format that we continue in the future. And I encourage anyone who's not here, you know, if you want to come to Alabama to see this work, it will be up through the beginning of December, and we'd love to have you. And we look forward to connecting again soon. So thank you, everyone.